Reissman, union activist, long-standing member of the party, and maybe she will tell you a little story about how she got fined £10,000, but then actually got it back. Over to you, Karen.
Cheers, thanks very much. It's always worth getting big fines off the police and then getting your money back and more. But yeah, I'm going to talk about sort of the 80s and from the miners' strike to the poll tax, how we beat Thatcher. For people who don't know, Margaret Thatcher was a Tory Prime Minister, a vicious Tory Prime Minister, and I think to understand how we ended up with a Tory Prime Minister and a Tory government for such a long time, you have to understand a little bit about before she came in. She was elected in 1979 with the Tories with a massive majority. And it came really, I want to start with the beginning of the 70s. Since the Second World War, there'd been a long sort of boom where companies carried on making profits. Normally you see booms and slumps and recessions, but there'd been a long sort of boom since the war. And really companies have been making profits. And if workers wanted better money or better rights or were unhappy about something and went out on strike, companies would be losing a lot of money by having people not making their products. And so we're quite quick to settle, and there was a level of real confidence amongst workers and often you'd be out on strike and back in before anybody knew, because they were quite quick to settle, and there was a level of militancy in there. The end of that happened around sort of 1970, and you began to see sort of attacks on workers and attacks on working class conditions, and people began to fight back. There were some very big, very heroic and massive victories where the militancy and the confidence that people had that they built from being able to come out on the ground, the organisation that people had on the ground, and there's some real militancy. Twice the miners fought the government, and twice they won. The dockers won. There were the women's Ford workers. There was a whole series of really quite important strikes, including the fact that the government, the Tory government then, in the early 70s, tried to bring in anti-trade union laws in order to stop the trade unions fighting back, and they were completely beaten on that. They were jailed some trade unionists, and huge demonstrations and strikes outside Pennsylvania prison got them released. And that was really the background sort of at the Tory government from 70 to 74. In 74 there was an election, who rules the country, which is a fairly stupid question in one sense, but the Tories actually found that when they went saying surely we should be running the country, the government, people voted in the Labour government, which did send a message. Unfortunately, because the economy continued to go down, that Labour government then did a deal with the trade union leaders, and they brought in what was called the social contract. The social contract said that inflation's going up, sounds familiar, that, you know, we're not making as many profits as we used to. What we need to do is we need to find some solution to that, and what we're going to do is we're going to have restrictions on how much wage rise you can have. And so there was a social contract agreed between trade unions and the government about how to keep down wages. And really, it was that undermining of the legitimacy of a pay rise, the legitimacy of getting above inflation. And in order to impose it, you had the horrible situation. Pre-1974, 75, 76, picket lines were godsends. If you put a line up, there were instances where people would literally, they would stand there, one person saying, I'm a picket, and nobody would cross, even though there were thousands of people trying to get in. But the idea, you don't cross a picket line, you stand in solidarity. You had trade union leaders escorting one group of workers from one union across another union's picket line in order to maintain the social contract, and began to undermine some of the principles of trade union solidarity and that confidence that you had. And really, that only held. It held for quite a long time, but by 1978, workers had become really frustrated as their wages went even down. Inflation was 20-something%, and that the official social contract was 6% by then. And so there were a wave of strikes that happened, but because they were strikes that were built in a period where you were encouraged to see anybody who fought back as being against the good of society, there wasn't solidarity between them. There was a lot of divisions, there was a lot of people, even though they were fighting at the same time, they were fighting on their own, and saying, I deserve a pay rise, but you don't, and no real solidarity. And at the end of that, there was an election in 1979, and on the back of that, Margaret Thatcher and the Tories got elected. So it was on the back of a Labour government no longer standing up for workers in a way that they had in claimed to be, standing on the back of the militancy of 74 and before, but on the back of, I'm keeping your wages down. Why would workers vote for Labour? So lots and lots of workers moved and voted Tory. And in a way, Thatcher, unlike some of the current Labour politicians, had a real fear of trade unions. They understood that we have the power to change the world, that we have the strength and the confidence. And she understood that unless she could sort of in some ways keep them down, they were never going to get away with what they wanted to do. And they had what was called the Ridley Plan, which was invented by one of the Tory ministers, Nicholas Ridley, which is we need to take on workers one at a time. We have to do it in a way where we just have one group at a time. If that means paying other people off when one group are fighting, that's what we need to do. We need to start with the easier ones, and we need to sort of, beat them, and then move on to the ones that are more difficult. So in 1981, there was a miners' dispute. It was very quickly conceded because there were other disputes, a steel dispute and others that were going on at the time, and they didn't want any solidarity and anything happening at the same time. And so they worked their way through the steel industry, the civil service, the car industry, and worked their way up to 1984, when they decided and had prepared, and again that was part of the Ridley Plan. You don't attack a group of workers unless you've done the preparation. So they had a year of preparation, a year of stockpiling coal, and they took on the miners. And unfortunately, the same trade union leaders that had escorted people across picket lines and been part of the social contract left those miners to fight on their own. All the people who fought had fought heroically, but because they'd been left on their own to fight, had been beaten. And that created a sort of a pessimism and a discontent about whether it was possible to. And the coal industry and the miners were one of the people who were seen, because of what they'd done in the 70s, as being incredibly strong, but in a sense were left to fight on their own. They were denounced by the leaders of the Labour Party, and they were denounced by the TUC. Denounced because they wouldn't have a ballot, a postal ballot, they wouldn't go back to work. One pit had been threatened with closure. They then went and picketed other pits that were going to be threatened with closure soon. They picketed everybody out, and they did it in a way that we demand working class solidarity. They want to get you now. We are angry now. We need to respond now. And the trade union law said, go back to work, calm down a bit, have a postal ballot, and then you can come out and strike if everyone agrees. And the miners knew that that would lose the momentum, but the TUC and Labour used that as an excuse not to back them. But even then, right, there were lots and lots of occasions during the miners' strike when it would have been possible for them to win. There's a myth that somehow the miners' strike was inevitably going to lose. And in fact, that the other strikes were inevitably going to lose. There was nothing inevitable about it. There were 3 different groups of workers that could have come out in solidarity with them. There was the deputies, who were the health and safety people in every pit. And if they'd come out and strike, nobody can go underground at all. And they balloted, and then they were paid off. The dockers, who were out on strike, balloted at the same time, were then given a sort of paid off, and they were postponed until the year after and beaten after the miners' strike had been beaten. There was Liverpool Council, who were out over cuts in councils, who were waging a massive sort of battle over that, and they gave in. They were paid off for a year and were taken on a year later after the miners' strike had been beaten. And some of that divide and rule that existed throughout that, where sort of, where they got away with it because they took the trade union seriously. They had a plan, they implemented it, and trade union leaders refused to do the things that we need to do in order to keep solidarity. And I mean, people won't remember their names, but the hated Norman Willis, if you are of the age where you lived through the miners' strike, some of the disgusting things that you imagine coming out of the words of trade union leaders to denounce people who are fighting for their very community's lives. And so in a way, out of that, there was a further election. They were elected again, and they were elected again. And out of that confidence, they were elected in 1987. They then decided that they'd done the Ridley Plan. They'd undermined and beaten people one by one. They'd created the divide and rule. Now was a time for a massive action that would undermine sort of everybody. They brought in a hated poll tax. You used to have a council tax where if you had a small house you paid a small amount, if you had a mansion you paid a huge amount. They changed that to everybody pays the same, whether you're a dustbin man or a duke. And we all pay the same, and that was a way of massively attacking working class, living class standards. And in a way, it was the opposite, the antithesis of the Ridley plan, which is one at a time, where she did everybody at one go, all the working class together. And I think the anger that had pent up and the sort of the injustice of something that was so fundamentally unfair just quite quickly took a hold. And the meetings, very at the beginning, were quite small. I went to a meeting in New and we organised a protest, and 4 of us came to picket our local councillor, who then came round and bled my radiators, which was a sign of how little it was. But then, a month later, we had hundreds at a meeting, 300 or 400 at a meeting. So the poll tax groups grew very, very quickly. And they grew to a massive non-payment campaign where lots and lots of people didn't pay, but they also grew to bigger and bigger demonstrations. There was one that was the day before it was due to be implemented on the 31st of March 1990. There were 200,000 people marching in actually what was quite a carnival atmosphere at the beginning. There were families, there were sort of, you know, people, it was a nice day, people were just going out for what felt like a sense of we're standing together, we're fighting together. This we're not going to do it. We got to Trafalgar Square, and the police, who in a sense during the miners' strike and during the print disputes, there was a print dispute here early on in the 80s where there was a small little printing press, the Stockport Messenger, based in Stockport, moved to Warrington without any of the union rules, and was determined to push through non-unionised workforce. So they had mass pickets, and the police on those pickets on the miners' strike were given permission by Margaret Thatcher to do what you want. You could kill people, you could hit them, you could sort of do them. They occupied pit villages during the pits, sort of during the miners' dispute. They closed roads, they stopped people going places. I mean, they just made the law up, and the police were given carte blanche. They were Maggie Thatcher's boot boys, is what people called them, and they were Maggie Thatcher's boot boys. And they went on the poll tax demo with their heads still on that we can do whatever we want, Thatcher will let us get away from anything. And they just laid into people, just completely laid into people. They sent horses in, they sent people with truncheons, they smashed up that demonstration. I remember my mum watching it, she knew I was on it, she was watching telly, and she saw it on the news flash. And she just said she was just appalled because they showed it in order as it was happening. By the time it got to the 6 o'clock news, they'd shown it in reverse. Because unlike lots of people before them, the people on that poll tax demo fought back. They wouldn't put up with it, they were fuming. We have a right to be here, we have a right to sort of, and they fought back. And the police lost it that day. They did not win that battle at all. People went rampaging round the West End, sort of attacking posh cars, leaving small cars alone, attacking posh shops, leaving sort of small shops alone, and completely trashed. And then, of course, the next day in the papers, who denounces them? Not just Thatcher and the Tories, but again you find Labour and the trade union leaders denouncing the violence of the mob. And it took a big campaign on the ground to organise and fight to get a defence for people who had been attacked and fought back and have a right to fight back. And it's interesting because I think throughout all those, some of the lessons that you learn is that the police are not on your side, the police are part of the state, and they are not people who operate independently, and they may not feel like they need to. We haven't got many mass pickets at the moment, so they don't feel like they need to come and smash us, but if they wanted to, they would try and use those same tools again. We need to know that they're not an independent force, that they're not on our side, but also that the trade union leaders are not people who are automatically going to defend you. And the third thing is around sort of, what happened after the big demonstration and the attack by the police was that 14 million people didn't pay their poll tax. I didn't pay any poll tax or council tax. It came after it came in. They abolished the poll tax. But I didn't pay any of it for 7 years, which was a real bargain for me. I've never paid it yet. And in fact, trying to get back onto the register years after we won the poll tax and it's gone, I actually want to register now, because you didn't register even for the poll tax, was quite difficult. So there were loads and loads of people involved in it, but in a way we were involved as individuals rather than our strength. And the opportunity, we could have stopped the poll tax much quicker had the workers who collected it just said, I'm not collecting it. But their union, my union Unison, refused to allow them and said that would be illegal to do because the Tories brought in lots more laws of what was and wasn't legal. So the legal sort of way to oppose it had to be to refuse to pay it. And people went to jail. People in the SWP went to jail. Lots and lots of people went to jail. But you can't jail 14 million people. It clogged up the courts, and there were police sort of constables who were saying, I'm not arresting 300 people for not paying their poll tax today. It's not feasible. You've got to stop it. And in the end, the momentum built up and Thatcher was driven out. And there was a massive sort of, boost to people's confidence and sense as a result. It took a bit longer to get rid of the whole Tory government, partly because Labour was never seen as being part of the people who got rid of them, and therefore they weren't the automatic answer to them. But I do think that the lessons that we can learn are that trade union leaders and the Labour Party can't be trusted, and that we have the action of ourselves is stronger. But when you fight together, that's when you win. And even now, you look at how many different unions are out on strike, but why are we not planning for them all to be out on strike at the same time? Why are we not trying to sort of completely undermine what goes on? And in a way, we're still fighting our own individual battles. And although there is a desire to, I think we have to fight stronger to get that. I think there are easier ways than don't pay, and that's about don't collect and fight and resist. But I think the other thing is that, that even the best trade union leaders, the leader of the miners' strike in 1972 and 74 was actually quite right-wing, but they won because they had organisation on the ground and militancy in order to overcome that. In 1984-5, they had a very left-wing union leader, Arthur Scargill, but they lost, and they lost because they didn't have that same organisation on the ground, and they didn't have the solidarity in order to win. And I think even now, you look at Mick Lynch, and Mick Lynch sort of, you hear him on the television, you can't help but thinking, God, it's nice to hear somebody expressing some sort of genuine sort of class politics. But it's not 6 months ago when the RNT didn't back the P&O dispute and allowed people to be sacked illegally and lose their jobs and leave the new ships sort of, without trade unions and without sort of the safety that comes with it. So I think now some of the parallels are, this government is not scared enough of us. And I think there is a militancy growing, and they don't have a plan in the way that Thatcher and Ridley did, and that should give us some real confidence. There is a real sense that everybody's in it together, because the cost of living stuff, there isn't anybody in this room that isn't affected by it, and therefore some of the solidarity is much easier built. But also there is a desire for people to begin to get organised because they know that they don't trust the people who are leading us. The Labour Party is not an option, and I think often trade unions have people thinking, I need to be involved, I need to be active, I need to do something about it. And that creates the basis where you can rebuild some alternative in which to challenge and make sure that the struggles we have today don't go down but win.